Hey guys, it's Josie. Hope that you're having a good week. I know that midterms are coming up, and so I hope that you guys have been able to, stay focused for all of that. Um, Today, I wanted to provide you with sort of a part two to the Rehab Act PowerPoint and training that I provided last week. And again, we're going to be meeting soon to talk about your projects, but this is all really good information to start thinking through what piece of the Rehab Act that you want to do your project on, and in what format. And we'll talk about that more next time, but wanted to kind of get this started. So I'm going to share my screen with the PowerPoints. And I'm going to first just go to the first slide. But takes me a minute to get the slideshow started. My apologies. Okay, guys. So again, this is the Rehab Act continued. And so as a recap of what was in the previous video, the Rehab Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies. And so generally, if an organization accepts federal dollars, then it is covered by the Rehab Act. So most primary schools, most colleges, there are some private colleges that don't, most hospitals and facilities. So there's a lot covered by this law. Um, and people with disabilities are defined in this law as individuals with a physical or mental impairment, which substantially limits one or more major life activities. And this definition is actually one of the broadest ones that there are. And so this tends to be the definition that a lot of other laws base off of, because it doesn't give examples of types of disabilities too much. It doesn't limit what things are or are not disabilities. So it's nice umbrella definition. Okay, now we're going to go into more of what the Rehab Act really looks like in reality. So it provides opportunities for children and adults with disabilities in education, employment, and other settings like medical or therapy or things like the foster system. And it is enforced through private lawsuits. And this is the same as the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think there's a common misconception that there's some oversight entity enforcing it, but in reality, it tends to be folks with disabilities either filing with the federal government, or creating lawsuits and then going through the whole process of a lengthy lawsuit. And something that I think that a lot of outsiders don't understand is when you do a lawsuit, you're not filing to get money back or anything. The suit is to correct the inaccessible situation, and then there might be some money for your time in the suit, but it's usually less than $1,000. So some of the basic requirements under Section 504 can be basic program accessibility. So can somebody access the program, which could be physical, it might be understanding the information, accessible communication with people who may have hearing loss or vision disabilities. So access, again, to information, and then new constructions or alterations. So if a major physical change has occurred to a body, like a physical body or entity, then accommodations should be included. But once again, this is only if they receive federal funds. So there's a few sections we're going to specifically highlight that are mentioned the most. And so Section 501 and 503 are both really on employment. It prohibits employment discrimination in the actual government and the government contractors. So that is one, but it's kind of a narrow focus on those groups. Then Section 508 is access to information, which creates access requirements for information technology by the federal government. A majority of sites, however, try to align themselves at least with 508 standards. There's a lot of other information access laws, but you'll tend to see on a website 508 compliant, and that's what this refers to. Moving on to Section 504, which likely you guys have heard more about, and you all may want to focus your projects on, maybe not, but this is access to programs or activities receiving the federal financial assistance. And this protects folks who apply to and participate in programs such as jobs and employment. Each federal agency issues, administers, and enforces its own Section 504 regulations. And it says no qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall be excluded from, denied the benefit of, or be subject to discrimination under any programs or activities that either receive federal funding or are directly the federal government. You will see this Section 504 over and over, specifically in education, but can be applied in other places. So when we're talking about Section 504 in employment, you'll see there reasonable accommodation means an employer is required to make reasonable steps to accommodate an individual unless it would cause undue hardship. And you will see that in the Americans with Disabilities Act too. When those bills were signed, there was a lot of concern that they could cause bankruptcy in businesses, and so that language was integrated into both. For the purposes of employment, qualified individuals with disabilities are persons who, with reasonable accommodations, can perform the essential functions of the job for which they have applied or have been hired. And so it's not, you might have heard about some jobs, they're job carving, or there are various other types of job, but this is saying that essentially they can do the main points of the job, but they might need an accommodation like a ramp or something. And complaints alleging employment are made to the Equal Employment Opportunity federally, but this tends to be an extremely slow process. Now we look at healthcare and human services under Section 504. So once again, any healthcare service or system that is supported with federal dollars, which could be Medicaid and Medicare, must comply with Section 504. And for this, one of these facilities cannot deny qualified individuals the opportunity to participate or benefit from the services, programs, deny access to programs, services, or benefits or opportunity as a result of physical barriers, and deny employment opportunities, including hiring, promotion, training, or fringe benefits for which they would otherwise be entitled to. So you can see that it's both from if you are a recipient of care or if you are applying for jobs in those situations. Going back to education, if you have thought about working in secondary education, primary education, you've probably heard about FAPE, Free Appropriate Public Education. And this is in K through 12 public schools. It means appropriate means provide supports to give a child access to the same education. And this is different from IDEA in that it doesn't necessarily modify the education. It just helps to have equal access to it. And so that could mean things like interpreter services, physical access, but schools are required to then do an evaluation and to help find students who may qualify for these services. And under this, a student can get a 504 plan, which is often the first step before a student may get a IEP or individualized education program. It tends to not have the legal teeth that an IEP does, but often does provide the needed supports. For most of my school years, I actually had a 504, and for me, I was homebound quite a bit, so I had a tutor. I had a nurse with me. I had needed physical access, and so they were able to cover quite a bit of my needs just under a 504 plan. The next goal, and I guess I didn't mention this, the first goal under Section 504 for education is this free and appropriate public education. Goal number 2 is prohibiting discrimination. And so make sure that individuals can fully benefit from programs and activities that have received federal funding. It can also include housing, K through 12 schools, colleges, gives people the right to reasonable accommodations. However, the law says that people with disabilities don't have a right to accommodations that would, quote, fundamentally alter an activity. So once again, this is sort of where you may see in education where they would change from a 504 to an IEP, because once you hit the fundamentally altering the material or the classroom, then it needs to change to an IEP. Here are a few resources. Check them out. I think generally they're pretty helpful. And the first one is from the Center for Parent Information Resources, which is a national parent center. And then the next is a fact sheet on what you need to know. So here's a very long slide, but there were recently, under the former administration, some changes and some final rule making that happened to Section 504. And on May 1st, 2024, Health and Human Services at the federal level released final rules which ultimately strengthened the Rehab Act, particularly in healthcare and other human service programs. And we're just going to go through these. I'm basically going to read them and describe them. But the first change was it ensures that medical treatment decisions are not based on stereotypes, judgment that an individual will be a burden, or that life as a person with a disability has less value. And this was a huge issue during COVID when there were limited resources and they really had triage who got the services. And so often, unfortunately, biases based on a presumed quality of life of a person with disability was used as a reason to not provide a certain resource, rather than understanding the full situation, and that the presumed quality of life is often very different than the reported quality of life by that person. The next one is it clarifies obligation for web, mobile, and kiosk accessibility. Historically, there have been many issues with portals, with kiosks not being accessible, and so this further requires it. And what was interesting about this is a lot of those apps or kiosks were developed by external groups, and so requiring it for Health and Human Service facilities, even though it's created by an external programmer or company, was a little bit tricky. It establishes enforceable standards for accessible medical equipment, and a lot of this comes down to accessible exam tables, accessible scales, and making sure that all the diagnostic equipment, there's at least one in each facility that is accessible for folks with various disabilities. Moving on to the next one, clarifies requirements in child welfare programs and activities. For example, foster care. There had previously been some undue requirements for foster parents who had disabilities, and this further clarifies that as long as the family or individual is able to provide the necessary care, and in emergency situations, that their application to be foster parents should not be denied. It further talked about some of the services that those facilities provide where kids in the system who may also have disabilities can be a part of, and ensures that access. Next one, prohibits the use of value assessment methods that place a lower value on life extension for individuals with disabilities when that method is used to limit access or deny aids, benefits, and services. And this goes further into what I shared earlier about things like when ventilators were limited for folks with disabilities based on a disability and nothing else. And then the last one, clarifies obligations to provide services in the most integrated environment. There are always different clinics for certain disabilities, certain different rooms. And so this is trying to enforce that when at all possible, it should be fully integrated in the least restrictive environment. So kind of thinking through both your future, the jobs that you want to have, your interest areas, something you want to learn more about. These are kind of a jumping off point for your projects. And maybe you already have one in mind, and that's great. But think about the following. You could use any section of the Rehab Act, but preferably one that will apply to your work. You may want to create training material. You may want to make social media posts or information sheets, but you could also utilize the new rules on health and human services, because that is still something that's new. We do not thoroughly understand or know how these will be integrated under the new administration, but as of right now, they're still being carried out and enforced. But think about those things as you start thinking through your project. I'm looking forward to actually talking with all of you, and we'll see you soon.